Welcome to our show. I'm your host, Will Bushman, and this is our last and final episode, Sam, of our series on education. Why don't you catch us up on where we've been?
All right, so we've had 2 episodes so far. In the first episode, we talked about the foundations of education and how it was so saturated in Christianity and faith. And then on our last episode, we talked about how there was a move toward nationalizing education in the sense that you had the common school movement and land grants and public universities. And slowly but surely, the public schooling system began to replace the private schooling system, which was wonderful and it had noble intentions. But in the last episode, we talked about how in the 1930s, there was a significant movement of people coming out of Columbia University, John Dewey, George Counts, other peoples that came out of the Frankfurt School that had an agenda of transforming the education system in America with the aim of undermining everything that America was made to be. And so we talked about the pillars of civil government that were, our rights come from God, not from government. That was undermined. We talked about how you had individual rights over and above the collective. That was undermined. We talked about how you needed absolutes and a common agreed upon view of virtues and ethics. That was undermined. And lastly, the idea of limited government, which was so important to the founders. That was undermined in all of this education. And because they had a monopoly on the training up of future educators, with being the first and only teachers college in the country, and then populating other colleges and schools around the country, they gained a monopoly on education. And to this day, they hold a near unanimous monopoly on education. And you see one side of the political spectrum that has a stranglehold on all higher education and the public school system. And so it's creating quite a lot of consequences for the nation.
Yeah, I guess that is our goal today, is to have a conversation about, okay, since all of that stuff has happened, where has it left us today?
So yeah, I mean, so from the 30s, you have this movement into the 60s with a lot of the more radicalization of things. And so the question is, okay, if we've had this revolution in the way that education is done and the way that we see civil society, are things better? And that's what we want to get into today. And by some measures, people would say, okay, well, we spend way more money on education than we ever have. So if you went back to 1960 and you adjusted for inflation and everything else, we spend 250% more on education now than we did in 1960. So you would think, okay, well, that must be really good. If you look at where we rank against all the nations of the world, we spend second most per pupil of any nation on planet Earth. And number 1 is Luxembourg, which has less than 700,000 people. So they almost don't count. Like, they're wealthy, they don't have a lot of people, so they can afford to spend a lot per pupil. But you look at the United States, we spend $14,400 for every student in our elementary and secondary, primary and secondary education, so K to 12. Then we spend $35,100 for every student post-secondary, so in the collegiate level. So that's a massive expense. And so then the question becomes, is it paying off? Is it paying off? And the answer that we're going to see throughout this episode is in virtually every conceivable, measurable category, the answer is no. And by the way, I said it was 250%. It's 350%.
That's a lot different.
Way more. And so money has not solved the problem. If the foundational philosophies are broken, you can throw all the money you want at it, and it's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, it's really became a broken system, and what we're seeing today is pretty obvious once we get into all this.
That's right. And so when you think about education, if you were to ask somebody, how is the education system, the most obvious things to look at are, well, let's go to reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? You would look at the academic discussions, the academic areas, and say, how are our students doing? And so we're going to go through a lot of statistics. They're very depressing.
Good to know early on.
I'm going to give you the warning up front. So when they measure the United States students against other students around the world, there's a international group called the Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. There's 34 countries that participate in this. And so like let's just look at math. Peggy Carr, who's the commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, says this, quote, "Mathematics remains the subject that the US fares worst in comparatively, and our students continue to score below the average for all the member nations." And so we're at the bottom. We have fewer students that are exceptional on the high end and way more students that are really struggling and are on the very, very bottom end of that. And so the US average score was 20 points below the international average. It was 12 points below what it was in 2012. So it's not just that we're bad, we're declining. And so the progression, the trajectory, the momentum is going in a bad direction. And so here's some things. The National Assessment of Education Progress, which is a big thing that the government does to measure where we are on these subjects, pointed out that only 24% of 13-year-olds were taking algebra in this past school year, which was down 34% from a decade ago. So in terms of our students, excelling and getting to high levels of mathematics, we're declining more and more and more, falling further and further behind every year. And in fact, the average US student is almost a full year behind the average student from these other nations. Wow. And in Singapore, they're actually more than 3 years ahead of the average US student. So in terms of mathematics, which is really, really important for a nation's competitiveness in the global stage, we're falling further and further behind.
And the outcome's also going to be worse 10 years from now, because as math builds on itself, we're just going to fall deeper and deeper.
That's correct. And that's the fear. And so scholars are looking at this going, we have a significant problem. Schools need to begin focusing more on academics to fix this problem. And the knock on schools is they're not focusing on academics heavily enough. They've become, indoctrination centers where a lot of the stuff that was being promulgated in the 30s and then again in the 60s has now been mainstream. And that's education is spending way too much time addressing things like that, as opposed to teaching our kids basic mathematical skills.
Which seems to be a real problem.
A big problem. That's right. Absolutely right. When the nation made a move to secularize schools, a lot of it was, we believe in superstition. That was the knock on religion. We need to take superstition out of the classroom and get rid of all these things that are not rational, empirical, data-driven. And so you'd think, like, what they would say is, if we could just get all that out of the classroom, then we'll be able to have this really robust, wonderful education system. And the reality is we were doing way better before. Now we're actually slipping and falling apart. And that continues into every academic discipline. So for instance, science. So that OECD, where we're compared to all other nations, the US ranks below the international average among these 34 different nations. We ranked 20th out of 34. And according to a 2018 Business Insider article, they said the US ranked, and they took more nations into account, and they said the US ranked 38th in math and 24th in science. Well, that used to not be the case. We used to be among the leaders of the world in these disciplines, and now we're falling apart to where the National Assessment Governing Board chair, Beverly Perdue, says U.S. students are struggling across the board. It is a major issue, and everybody agrees that it's a major issue. So like when you think about science and mathematics, those are kind of the core issues of STEM. That's the cutting edge of where the world is going. We should be on the front lines of that, and we're falling further and further behind. And so, we're a mess in that category, but how do you think we should be faring in terms of literacy?
You mean how many people do I think should be literate in our nation?
Yeah, how many people are reading at a level where they should be?
I think 80% should be.
Yeah, in America, you would think that would be the case. Let me read to you from the U.S. Department of Education. 54% of all U.S. adults, that's 130 million people, lack proficiency in literacy and are reading below the equivalent of a 6th grade student.
That's scary.
Yeah, and that's 54% of all U.S. adults.
That's over half of us.
Are reading at an elementary grade level. So that's a big problem. And the percentage of 8th grade public school students that are performing above just basic proficiency levels is 29%. So that's a big problem. Yeah. We've got a nation that's falling further and further into illiteracy, students that are falling further and further behind in their ability to read. So let's jump to the next. How do you think we're doing in civics, our understanding of who we are as a nation and our government? How do you think we're doing, Will?
I know we're not doing great.
That one's pretty obvious. And some of these are just like, you have to laugh because—
So you don't cry.
That's correct. So here's one from the National Assessment of Education Progress. 22% of American students scored proficient in civics. A 2016 survey that was done by the Annenberg Public Policy Center found that 26% of Americans can name all 3 branches of government. So that's like a core central to who we are as a country. You know, executive.
I just want to do it in my own mind just to make sure I'm not a part of that.
I'll quiz you on the spot. So executive, legislative, judicial, 26% of people can do that. 24% of college graduates know that the First Amendment keeps the nation from establishing a religion. 57% don't know that there's 9 justices on the court. And I thought this was really fascinating. Princeton did a study where they took the immigration exam that you have to take if you're coming from another country and you want to become a U.S. citizen and you have to pass this exam. Only a third of Americans, 36%, can pass the U.S. citizenship exam. So our own citizens can't pass the citizenship test. And so that is a big problem. And it gets you to like where Jefferson talks about, you know, he said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. And you go back and you think about how the turn in education happened. You know, we don't know who we are. We don't know how we were founded. And if you don't know who you were, you don't know who you are. And you don't know where you're going. And so it makes the nation a revolution of ideas much, much easier. And civics instruction is definitely neglected.
All right, so it seems like we're failing at everything. What other subjects does it look like are going badly?
Well, we haven't touched history. Kind of related, civics related, but only 13% of students are proficient in history. And so here's some stats that are just kind of surprising, semi-depressing. 60% of students couldn't identify what countries we fought against in World War II. 24% knew the reason why the colonists fought against Great Britain, which means the overwhelming majority have no idea why we were founded. 24% could name one thing about the founder, Benjamin Franklin. More than that, 37% believed he invented the light bulb.
You know? I've heard that one, though.
Have you?
Yeah.
So you have this one I loved. So there's a survey of 1,000 people. A couple of dozen of them believed that the Cold War was to fight against global warming. Like this. But I mean, that's what's put in front of them all day long. And then you look at geography. 2/3 of Americans cannot identify Great Britain on a map. A majority of Americans, young high school graduates, can't identify Ohio on a map. So it's like history, geography, civics, math, science, literacy, language arts. In every category, we're failing, we're below average, and we're declining. So when you think, okay, we're going to get rid of religion so that we can just be really rational, empiricist, we're going to be really smart, the fruit of that has shown the exact opposite. The public institutions of education in America are failing, and maybe even we could say collapsing.
Yeah, because it points to a real institutional problem over anything else.
That's right.
Because it's not like we have bright spots. It's not like some of these things we're not great at, but in fact, all across the board, and the whole system is failing children.
Yes. And some people would say, here's a bright spot for you. Some people would say the dropout rate from high schools is among the lowest it's ever been. And the answer to that is, yeah, because
They're not learning anything.
they're not learning anything and the standards aren't there. And we're graduating a bunch of people that are not educated. And so if you don't have any standards, it becomes much easier to graduate. And so that actually is a problem, that we're producing this and yet so many graduates. It means, what is the value of a high school diploma? Nothing. We're not even proficient in any subject that we've talked about. And that's just proficient.
Yeah, that's a pretty low bar, right?
Yeah.
When you say proficient, that's not...
That means just bare minimum capable. And this has been a problem for a while. Like getting into the 80s, the education secretary at the time, Terrell Bell, he's got this quote that I just absolutely love because I feel this way. He said, if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves. We have, in effect, been committing an act of unthinking, unilateral educational disarmament. Spot on.
And Sam, the crazy part about after we go through all of those numbers is the fact that there's no huge uproar about this. Like, you hear the news and you hear people talk in town halls and all of this chaos that is erupting about the school system in our world. It has nothing to do with education, really. It has to do with all the cultural baggage and all the cultural issues that have really put a spotlight on it.
Yeah, that's totally right. Like, it's very rare that you hear people talking about math, science, language arts or something. But there's huge uproar over all of the social stuff and the things that are going on in the classrooms. And I think Americans are beginning to wake up that there has been this movement that's going through the public schools that is training them to hate everything that the country's ever been. And so let me give you some stats on that. So they just did a study, and only 18% of Americans aged 18 to 34, so just coming out to college in the workforce, 18% of Americans are very proud to be Americans. Now, you compare that with only a decade ago, 85% of all adults were very proud to be American. 18% of this generation that's just coming out. Half of Americans in other categories feel very proud, but the younger people are coming out saying, I don't like my country, I'm not proud of it at all. And when you look at the kinds of philosophical views that they have on what kind of government we should have, get this, 45% of Gen Z has a negative view of capitalism. 51% have a positive view of socialism. Does that sound familiar? So we're getting back to this plan that goes back to the 30s of wanting to seed the schools with a Marxist socialist view.
It's working.
Well, now we've got Gen Z coming out, and there are more Gen Z young people that have a positive view of socialism than capitalism, which is part of the core elements of our foundations as a country.
Yeah, that's absolutely terrifying.
Isn't it?
Yeah,
It really is. It really is. And so when parents get involved and they're saying, I object to this being taught or that being taught, or all the exposure to the sexual chaos that you find in textbooks and in classroom lessons, now all of a sudden parents are finding that they're being stripped of their rights, and school boards and teachers are just kind of trampling over them and saying, you have no say here. And you go back, like, this is something, when you go back to the Soviet view of how they did that, and you remember the Soviet revolution that brought communism to Russia was in 1917. The next year, the workers that ran the education program over there, that all of our people were going over to Russia to check out, said this was their policy: we must turn children who can be shaped like wax into real good communists. We must remove the children from the crude influence of their families. And so in these Marxist nations, you had them say the state needs to educate them. We can't entrust education to the parents. Well, that's a biblical idea. The responsibility for training up education in the students belongs to the parents. But you go to Germany, another socialist country before, in Hitler's day, and he says the state is to be responsible for the fundamental reconstruction of our whole national education program. And in every state where you see liberty fall and totalitarian regimes rise, it's when the government says, we're taking over, we're responsible for education. Parents, you go away. So now let me read to you a very terrifying decision from one of the second highest courts in our nation, right under the Supreme Court, the Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, listened to this ruling that they gave in Fields versus Palmdale School District. Get this. There is no fundamental right of parents to be the exclusive provider of information regarding sexual matters to their children. Parents have no due process or privacy right to override the determinations of public schools as to the information to which their children will be exposed while enrolled as students. Parents have no constitutional right to prevent a public school from providing its students with whatever information it wishes to provide, sexual or otherwise.
That's real.
That's real. Google it. Wild that that's happening. And there's multiple decisions like this that you find throughout the nation where parents are being systematically stripped of their right to object or to be involved in the education of their kids. Like this recently, there was a proposal that the parents were going to have a Bill of Rights and involved in education that Congress was pushing. Guess who the biggest opponents of it were? The National Education Association, like the biggest teacher unions, come out and say they're trying to ban books. They're trying to take away teacher academic freedom. And in that, the Bill of Rights just says parents should be aware of what's being taught, and they should have the right to pull their kids if they find it objectionable. And the whole educational establishment goes haywire. Why? Why would you want to force a child whose parent has real concerns over a particular issue and demand that that parent not have a right to do so? I mean, you've seen some of the stuff from these books that are in schools and school libraries that are outright pornographic. It's that when parents say, I don't want that in my kid's library, that's what they're claiming is us banning books. Why are they doing that? It's because they don't want parents to have a say in education, which is terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, it's evil to a degree, and this whole series, we've even talked about how twisted it is because it's a really good plan that they've been playing for decades. Like, let's take the kids at their most malleable, when they're easiest to mold and shape into what we want, and we may not win this war next year or the year after, but now look at us in 2023, it seems to have all worked out for them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really hard to look at this and not see the brilliance of how this has been a revolution without ever firing a shot. And organizations like the biggest teacher unions in the nation, like the NEA or the American Federation of Teachers, like you would think that they would spend most of their energy looking out for the welfare of children and dealing with these scores that we've been talking about that are through the floorboards. But instead, if you go to their website, you'll see that they are involved in pushing for abortion and pushing for the LGBTQ plus agenda and pushing for all these things that are super politically charged and almost always ideologically aligned with one side to the exclusion of the other. The largest union in the country, it's massive influence over our systems, and they have a stranglehold on it.
All right, Sam, so it's obviously clear that we've been failing them academically. It's clear that we failed them in a cultural manner. And you would have to be living under a rock to not look at this next generation here that, man, it's an absolute mental health crisis that we're facing with the youth.
That's absolutely right. The CDC, it feels like every year they're coming out with some new report talking about record levels of suicide or anxiety disorders. And you see that, like this, the most recent one, teen girls are experiencing record high levels of violence, sadness, and suicide risk. Nearly 1 in 3 seriously considered attempting suicide, up 60% from a decade ago. Now, usually you see those kinds of things move in like 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5%, up 60% from a decade ago. Mental health issues has worsened significantly, according to the CDC. We have 5.6 million kids now that have been diagnosed with anxiety disorders before the pandemic, and 2.4 million diagnosed with a depressive disorder. And so you, again, like when we look and we say, hey, we're going to take out of education any reference to God, to prayer, to scriptures, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, public schools, you're not allowed to talk about the ultimate reason for existence. You're not allowed to acknowledge that there might be some purpose for life that's outside of just this material universe. And when kids are left to fend with against the idea, that the only thing in this world is the short time you live and how much money you make and what you do with your life, they start going, what's the point of it all? And should we be surprised that when you take the hope of the gospel or the hope of religion out of public discussion even, that they're collapsing under the weight of the despair of it all? It's so predictable. I mean, if you were to tell me, Sam, you couldn't go about your day without acknowledging any hope beyond yourself and this culture that we're living in right now, I would have some serious problems. And we're doing that to an entire generation of kids, and they're crumbling under the weight of it.
Yeah, and even the study that I'm looking at right here from Modern in the Future, which has tracked these 3 questions that they give to 8th, 10th, and 12th graders from 1991, and they've gone all the way up to 2023. And so the one thing, do you agree with the statement, I can't do anything right? In 1991, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders would have said about 25% would agree with that. But then you go to 2023, 49.5 8th, 10th, and 12th graders would agree with that. The statement, my life is not useful, just like what you're talking about with purpose and hope. In 91, again, just over 25% would agree with that statement. Guess what it is in 2023? 44.2%. And then last but not least, which obviously after answering those 2 questions that way, would they agree with the statement? Remember, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, I do not enjoy life.
Wow.
And that was in 1991, that was around 23%. And in 2023, it's 48.9%.
I do not enjoy life.
Half of 8th, 10th, and 12th grade students.
I don't remember thinking those things when I was, but it's getting more and more oppressive in these nations. And this is where, like, when you take those categories and you compare them to students that do have exposure to religion, it's night and day. It's night and day difference. So like in the USA Today or the University of North Carolina studies or Duke has done studies, and they find that college students who participate in religious activities are more likely to have better emotional and mental health than students with none. And students who don't participate in religious activities are twice as likely to report poor mental health. So it's not just random. You take that out, and all the studies are showing that. They're more likely, twice as likely to report depression than students who do that frequently. Here's another one. UNC did a study, and they followed all these students, and they found that religious students were less likely to drink, to struggle with addictions, to face depression, to engage in violence, receive traffic tickets, be combative with parents, skip school, steal, trespass, or suffer from in-school disciplinary actions. And now get what they received. It says they were more likely to have a positive outlook on life, to your point there, to receive higher grades, to exercise, to experience happier home lives and participate in extracurricular activities, graduate high school and find stable relationships with their peers. And what's the common thread? Students that engage in this stuff are far healthier than students where this is absent in their lives. And so what do we do as a society? We remove that from them. And now we're seeing it's absolutely evident. So another one, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth found that there's a direct correlation between the frequency of a student's church attendance and their GPA, and it's not a little one. Students who attend church weekly are 62% more likely to have mostly A's on their report cards than those who never attend church. And so the influence of giving kids something that's beyond themselves or their experience, but which they can really set their hope and find significance in a world that apart from the supernatural doesn't offer much, impacts every part of their life, not just their mental health, but it improves their academics.
Okay, so if faith really makes that big of a difference, do we see any difference between the public school system and maybe the private school system?
You do. And the studies bear that out. Like one of the tests that we talked about earlier, that's a big one, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is a direct quote from their report. They say the average private school mean reading score is 18.1 points higher than the average public school student mean, the average. And the average private school mean for mathematics is 12.3 points higher than the average public school student. And so on the ACT, private school students are 20 points higher in all 4 areas of the ACT, including English, reading, math, and science. And so they perform at a significant clip better than the public schools. And a lot of that can be explained by the correlation to faith. And some of it is also resources and the wealth gaps and things like that as well.
Of course.
But the reality is, confidence in our public education system is absolutely collapsing like it never has before. 28%, Gallup did a poll and found that 28% of Americans have confidence in our public school system.
It's very low.
That's very low. So most people acknowledge that it's failing. And the public schools have taken what the New York Times called a seismic hit in recent years. Like, the enrollment in public schools is like hemorrhaging. It's emptying out for consecutive years. Even before you got to COVID and the pandemic, it was already dropping. And on the other side of the pandemic, people are just not returning to the public schools. Meanwhile, enrollment in private schools and homeschool movements is actually climbing. And what's fascinating to me that I did not expect was that the same trend is happening in higher education. So the National Student Clearinghouse said that before COVID, there were 2.5 million fewer undergraduate students in colleges than there were in 2012. And since COVID, that number's dropped by another million. And so the number of students that are actually going to college is less and less and less. And surveys are showing, when they ask students, they just don't think that it's worth it. They think that college is overinflated, a degree is not worth the cost. Fewer than 1 in 3 adults now say that a college degree is worth the cost. That's wild. That shocked me when I first read that study. And this is from Gallup too. This is actually from the report. I'm just going to read it to you. Confidence in higher education, meaning the collegiate level, confidence in higher education in the U.S. has decreased significantly since 2015, more so than for any other U.S. institution that Gallup measures. So the percentage decline in higher education, more than any other institution. Like, people don't trust it. They think that it's failing.
That is a crazy stat.
And here's something from Harvard Business Review that was really fascinating to me. So they went around and they looked at 51 million job openings. And what they found is that recently, from 2017 to 2019, the number of positions that are now requiring college degrees is falling precipitously. So it dropped 46% for middle skill positions and 31% for high skill positions. And so even the employers are looking and saying, a college degree, what does that mean anymore? You know, the standards of what that used to mean, you wanted a college degree, you wanted a college graduate. Now that means less and less and less, to where employers are like, we don't need to require it. We'd rather see their skill set.
Yeah, because a college degree, at least it used to be, at least proved that you were capable of something.
That's right.
That you're good at studying, that you could pass exams, that you could work hard, that you could do all of that because of the standards. But now they're like, whatever, we'll rather just test them out in this job.
Yeah, it's like the same thing where in the public school boasts, we have one of the lowest dropout rates, but all the scores are failing. So what does that mean? And now you have this educational inflation where it used to be that very few people had a 4-year college degree, but now a lot of people do, and you have to get a master's, and now a lot of people get a master's, so now you got to get a doctorate. And so with each new stage, we're kind of inflating away the significance of a college education. And hear me, I'm not saying that a college education is not valuable. What I'm saying is that the deterioration of education in America has really damaged the credibility and the perceived value of what that means to have a college degree. And that's a shame.
So Sam, please tell me that we're not going to leave depressed. What is if there is a solution, and not saying that this has to be right or perfect, what do you think a solution could be for all this?
Yeah, I think the solution has to come when people say they demand better. And so, there's a number of elements that go into that. One, we have to get better at education and to demand better results on the academic front. That's an obvious one. But a big part of this has to deal with worldview issues. And so, there's been a big movement in the last couple of decades for school choice. And what that means is, if you jump in a time machine and you go back, the people who are raised in atheistic households feel you know, like ostracized or whatever if they have to send their kids to go to a Christian school, right? And they shouldn't be forced to do that. I think all fair-minded Americans that believe in individual rights don't want to compel someone to send their kids somewhere that's going to be teaching a worldview or a philosophy that's hostile to what they hold dear. Except now we do that. We force our families. So if you're in a poor neighborhood and you can't afford private school, you can't afford to homeschool, you are still forced to send your child to an institution that is going to be teaching the atheistic, humanistic, culturally Marxist, curriculum and platform that in a sense is indoctrinating your kid. And yet if you're poor, you have no choice but to send your kid into these failing schools with worldview education systems that are hostile to yours. And so I think all fair-minded people should understand that it's a wonderful idea to allow these people to choose where their kids go to school, whether it's the public schools or the private schools. And so some of the school choice movements attach dollars directly to each child and allow the parents to choose, I want to go to this private Christian school, Jewish school, Muslim school, Hindu school, or you have the humanist atheistic school with the public school. But it should not be that you compel somebody to send their children into an institution that's hostile to who they are.
That makes so much sense.
It's just basic fairness. I don't know why this is so controversial, but it is. And when you see school choice systems, you see great results where there have been, test cases of this in DC or in like Milwaukee. The number of students that ended up in prison with felony convictions when they introduced school choice dramatically dropped among those students that took advantage of that program. And DC students, the dropout rate fell 21% among the students that took advantage of the program. And here's the good news. Like right now, the average amount that we spend per student in primary and secondary education is over $17,000. The average cost of private school tuition's $12,350 right now. So it's actually a cheaper solution. It allows parents to obey their conscience and to feel good about sending their kids to school, knowing that it's going to be reinforcing what the family believes. It empowers parents to do what they want, and it's by far the fairest option, and it enables families that through no fault of their own, and probably through poverty, are stuck in districts with failing schools. And in the current system, they have absolutely no choice but to send their kid into a failing school. And all that that's going to mean for their future and generational cycles of poverty. And what I think we should get to is to enable parents to hold the place that the scriptures say that they have, which is the primary responsibility for the education of their children, and make parents responsible for this. But you shouldn't. So right now, in the public schools, like you and I have to pay taxes to fund the public schools and then pay private school tuition to send our kids. So it's like we're doubly responsible, which is also unfair, right? Why not do away with all this unfairness and give the dollars, attach the dollars to the student, and let the parent make the best decision for the sake of their children?
I mean, it seems like a great solution.
I'm in. And when you look at it, by the way, so one of the states that has done this is the state of Florida, and they did a study to say when parents took advantage of this program, what were their top 3 reasons for doing so? And in order, number 1, religious environment. They wanted a better worldview education for their kids, not the ones that the public schools were pushing. Number 2, they wanted morals, character, and values instruction that is absent in the public schools or is hostile to your morals in the public schools. And lastly, they wanted a safe environment. You had to go to number 4 before you got to academics. And so given the fact that private schools are superior in education, that's a bonus. And plus, we're going to be producing a more literate citizenry that's better equipped and more virtuous.
That's a really hopeful solution as well.
I believe so.
And that's exactly why we made this series. We want you to be educated. We want you to feel like you have a voice and a hope not just for your children's future, but for the future of this country. So thanks so much for tuning in and watching this.